In 1519, somewhere in the highland markets of Tlaxcala, a Spanish soldier watched a man purchase a tamale with 8 small brown seeds. The soldier wrote about it. He thought it was funny. He had no idea he was watching a transaction backed by the most sophisticated monetary system in the Western Hemisphere. Those seeds were cacao, and they were worth more than gold. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally more than gold in the markets of Tenochtitlan, because gold could not feed you. Gold could not be dissolved in water and drunk before battle, and gold did not grow in the specific lowland groves that only certain city-states controlled. Cacao did all of those things, and for roughly 3,000 years, across a stretch of civilizations that most people in Europe could not have named, this bean ran the economy, funded the military, sustained the priesthood, and sat at the center of every transaction that mattered. What happened to it afterward is one of the stranger financial stories on record. The Spanish did not destroy the cacao economy when they arrived. They used it. Then they broke it. Then, 300 years later, industrial chocolate companies rebuilt something from the wreckage and called it a treat for children. The bean that once paid soldiers' wages ended up in a foil wrapper sold for less than a cup of coffee. Here is how that happened. The earliest confirmed evidence of cacao processing dates to around 1900 BCE, from residue found in ceramic vessels at a site called Puerto Escondido in present-day Honduras. The residue was not solid chocolate, it was fermented pulp, almost certainly processed into an alcoholic drink. Cacao at that point was not prized for the bean inside, it was prized for the white, sweet, sour fruit that surrounds the bean, which ferments quickly and produces a low-alcohol beverage with properties that made it useful in ritual contexts. The bean was a byproduct. For perhaps 1,000 years, Mesoamerican peoples ate the fruit and threw away what we now consider the valuable part. At some point, someone roasted the discarded seeds. The exact location and date of that discovery are not recoverable. But by 600 BCE, the Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula were processing dried, fermented, roasted cacao beans into a paste and dissolving that paste in water. The resulting drink was bitter, fatty, and extremely calorie-dense. It was also stimulating in ways the Maya associated with divine energy. They called it cacao. The word predates the Maya civilization in its current form. Linguists have traced it to Proto-Mixi-Zocaean, a language family associated with the Olmec, which pushes the origins of the word and possibly the practice back another 1,000 years. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya manuscripts, contains images of cacao pods being held by gods. The Madrid Codex shows a deity biting into a cacao pod. In the Popol Vuh, the Quiche Maya creation text, cacao appears among the substances used to make human flesh. This was not decoration or poetic license. The Maya theology was built around agricultural fertility, and cacao sat at the intersection of nourishment, trade, and the divine in a way that European wheat or Asian rice never quite did in their own religious systems. By the time the classic Maya period reached its height, roughly 250 to 900 CE, cacao had become currency. Not currency in the sense that it was treated like currency or used occasionally as a substitute for money. Currency in the precise economic sense, a unit of account, a medium of exchange, and a store of value. The Maya established conversion rates between cacao beans and other goods. A small rabbit cost about 10 beans in the Yucatan markets, recorded by the Spanish friar Diego de Landa in the 1560s. He was writing down prices that had been stable for generations. A larger rabbit cost 30. A turkey egg cost 3. A tamale cost a single bean, which is what that Spanish soldier saw and misunderstood. The problem with using an agricultural product as money is that it can be counterfeited. Archaeologists working at several Maya sites have found cacao pods made of clay, painted to match the real thing, light enough to pass in a quick transaction. The Maya were aware of this. Merchants who dealt in large quantities employed specialists who could assess beans by weight, smell, and surface texture. There was an entire profession built around detecting fake cacao. The Aztec Empire, which consolidated power in central Mexico between roughly 1300 and 1521 CE, did not invent the cacao economy. They inherited it, expanded it, and made it more systematically extractive than any civilization before them. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built on an island in Lake Texcoco, did not sit in cacao-growing territory. The highlands of central Mexico are too cold and too dry for Theobroma cacao, which requires a specific band of tropical climate within roughly 20 degrees of the equator. This geographic fact shaped the entire Aztec economic system. Cacao had to come from somewhere else, which meant it had to be taxed, traded, or taken. The Aztec tribute system was documented in a manuscript called the Codex Mendoza, compiled around 1541 from earlier indigenous records under the supervision of the first Spanish viceroy of New Spain. It is one of the most detailed economic records from pre-Columbian America. The Codex Mendoza lists the tribute obligations of subject city-states in precise figures. Province by province, the manuscript records annual payments owed to Tenochtitlan. Cacao appears repeatedly. The province of Soconusco, on the Pacific coast of what is now Chiapas and Guatemala, owed 200 loads of cacao per year. One load was 24,000 beans. Soconusco alone sent 4.8 million cacao beans to the Aztec capital annually, as a single-line item in a much longer tribute list. Across all subject provinces, historians estimate the Aztec state collected somewhere between 980 and 1,040 loads of cacao per year by the early 16th century. That is roughly 24 million beans annually flowing into a single city, most of it used to pay soldiers, administrators, and priests, or stored in state warehouses as a reserve currency. Hernán Cortés, landing on the coast of Veracruz in 1519, was told about this system almost immediately. His interpreter, a woman the Spanish called Marina and the Mexicans called Malintzin, or La Malinche, was herself the daughter of a cacique from a cacao-producing region. She understood the monetary architecture of what the Spanish were walking into. When Cortés wrote back to King Charles I of Spain describing the wealth of Tenochtitlan, he specifically mentioned the cacao warehouses. He called the beans almonds because he had no other word for something used as currency that was also a food. "They have a drink made from these almonds," he wrote, "which they hold in greater esteem than wine." He was describing something that had been in continuous use for over 2,000 years. His soldiers had no framework for understanding it, several of them, finding what they thought were worthless seeds in looted storehouses, threw the cacao away. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 did not immediately dismantle the cacao economy. The Spanish were pragmatists. They needed to run the territory they had just conquered, and they had no replacement currency ready. For roughly 40 years after the conquest, cacao beans continued to circulate as money across New Spain. The Spanish crown, scrambling to assess the value of what it owned, sent officials who produced documents using cacao as a unit of account. Tax records from the 1540s list tribute obligations in both pesos and cacao loads, sometimes within the same sentence. The slow destruction of the cacao economy came not from any single policy decision, but from a combination of forces that eroded it over decades. Silver was the first. The opening of the Potosi silver mines in present-day Bolivia in 1545 flooded New Spain with metallic currency on a scale that no agricultural product could compete with. A currency only holds its value if it is scarce enough to be worth holding. Potosi silver was not scarce. By 1570, cacao's role as a monetary unit was contracting rapidly. The second force was demographic. The indigenous population of central Mexico collapsed after contact with European diseases. Estimates vary significantly, but the most careful demographic work, including a study published by Sherburne Cook and Woodrow Bora in 1963 based on tribute records, suggests the population of central Mexico fell from roughly 25 million in 1519 to fewer than 2 million by 1600. The people who used cacao as money, who understood its monetary conventions, and who staffed the markets where cacao transactions were recorded, died in enormous numbers within 2 generations of conquest. The institutional memory of the cacao economy died with them. What survived was the drink. Spanish priests initially tried to prohibit cacao consumption, partly because of its association with indigenous religious practices, and partly because there were ongoing theological debates about whether drinking cacao counted as breaking the Eucharistic fast. The debate was serious enough that Pope Gregory XIII reportedly received samples of the drink in Rome around 1580. The exact outcome of his assessment is not documented, but the Jesuit order, which ran many of the most economically productive missions in New Spain, began cultivating cacao on their landholdings in the 1590s. The Jesuits were not known for investing in products they considered spiritually dangerous. By 1600, cacao had completed its first transformation. From currency to commodity, it was no longer money. It was a raw material with a growing European market. The journey from Mesoamerica to European drawing rooms is usually told as a story of refinement and luxury, which is accurate but incomplete. What made cacao commercially viable in Europe was not its taste, which most Europeans in the 16th century found bitter and strange. It was its pharmacological properties. Cacao contains theobromine, a mild stimulant in the same chemical family as caffeine. It also contains small amounts of caffeine directly. A cup of prepared cacao drink in the Aztec style, made with roasted ground beans dissolved in water and sometimes mixed with maize, chili, or vanilla, delivers a noticeable stimulant effect. European physicians in the 17th century, working without any understanding of alkaloid chemistry, noticed this effect empirically and began prescribing chocolate drinks for conditions ranging from exhaustion to digestive disorders. The first documented sale of cacao in England took place in London in 1657 at a shop on Queen's Head Alley in Bishopsgate. The proprietor sold cups of prepared chocolate at 10 shillings per pound of solid cacao, which put it beyond the reach of anyone without significant disposable income. By the 1670s, chocolate houses had opened across London, competing with the coffee houses that had established the template. The clientele at London chocolate houses was, on average, wealthier than the coffeehouse crowd. Samuel Pepys mentioned drinking chocolate in his diary at least 4 times in the 1660s. He paid for it himself once. The other times, it was bought for him by men who wanted something. Chocolate houses became, in a pattern the Aztecs would have recognized, sites of financial transaction. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that still operates today, grew out of Edward Lloyd's coffee house in the 1680s. Several of its early rivals were chocolate houses. The stimulant drink and the deal went together because both required a certain kind of alertness. The Dutch were the first to mechanize cacao processing at scale. Conrad van Houten, a chemist working in Amsterdam, patented a hydraulic press in 1828 that could separate cacao butter from the solid mass of ground cacao. The result was a dry, relatively lean powder that dissolved much more easily in water than traditional ground cacao. Van Houten also discovered that treating the powder with alkaline salts reduced its bitterness and darkened its color. The process is still called Dutch processing and is used in commercial cocoa powder today. Van Houten's press made something else possible. By extracting cacao butter and then recombining it with ground cacao mass in different ratios, processors could create a solid that melted at just below body temperature. In 1847, the English firm Fry and Sons produced the first bar of solid eating chocolate using this method. It was gritty, uneven, and nothing like modern chocolate, but it proved the concept. The transformation from gritty experiment to smooth industrial product required one more step. In 1879, Rodolphe Lindt, a Swiss chocolatier working in Bern, ran a batch of chocolate through a stone grinding machine for 72 hours continuously and forgot about it. When he returned, the chocolate was smoother than anything produced before. The extended agitation had broken down residual sugar crystals, distributed the cacao butter evenly, and driven off volatile acids that contributed to bitterness. Lindt called the process conching because the machine's motion resembled the grinding action of a conch shell. He kept the method secret for 18 years before selling it to Rudolf Springly in 1899 for 1.5 million Swiss francs. Lindt's accident turned chocolate into something that could be standardized, scaled, and sold to people who had never tasted cacao in any form. The modern confectionery industry dates from that oversight in a Bern workshop. By 1900, the geography of cacao cultivation had shifted dramatically from its Mesoamerican origins. The Spanish and Portuguese had transplanted cacao trees to their colonies in Africa and Asia during the 17th and 18th centuries. The island of São Tomé, a Portuguese colony off the West African coast, was producing cacao commercially by the 1820s. Gold Coast, the British colony now known as Ghana, had its first significant cacao planting in 1879, the same year Lindt was accidentally inventing conching in Switzerland. The timing was not coincidental. Industrial chocolate required industrial quantities of cacao, and West Africa had the climate, the colonial labor structures, and the available land. By 1911, Ghana had become the world's largest cacao producer, surpassing every country in Latin America. Today, approximately 70% of the world's cacao comes from West Africa, primarily from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. The crop that originated in the forests of Mesoamerica and was tended for 3,000 years by peoples who treated it as sacred money now feeds a global industry worth roughly $130 billion annually, most of the growing done by smallholder farmers in West Africa, earning an average of less than $1 a day. The companies at the other end of that supply chain are among the oldest continuous businesses in the food industry. Cadbury, founded by John Cadbury in Birmingham in 1824, was still family-controlled until 1969. Nestlé, which entered the chocolate market in 1904 through a partnership with a company called Peter and Kohler, today controls approximately 20% of the global confectionery market. Mars, incorporated in 1920 by Frank Mars in Tacoma, Washington, has annual revenue exceeding $40 billion. These three companies, along with Mondelez International, the renamed successor to Kraft Foods, which absorbed Cadbury in 2010 for £11.9 billion, control the majority of what gets sold under the name of a substance the Aztecs used to pay soldiers. The connection between cacao and political upheaval did not end with the Spanish conquest, though it changed form. In the late 18th century, as chocolate houses spread across Europe and the Atlantic colonies, the cacao trade became entangled with the same tensions that were producing revolutions. The Boston that hosted the famous tea protest of 1773 also hosted chocolate merchants. John Hancock, one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts and the first and most prominent signatory of the Declaration of Independence, made part of his fortune in the import trade, and his merchant network handled cacao alongside other colonial goods. The economic grievances that built toward revolution were not about tea alone. They were about who controlled the flow of commodities from the colonies to Europe and who captured the profit. Cacao sat in that flow. In France, the years immediately before 1789 saw chocolate consumption stratify more sharply than at any earlier point. The aristocracy consumed chocolate in elaborate porcelain services at breakfast. The playwright and pamphleteer Jean-Paul Marat, one of the most radical voices of the revolution, specifically named the morning chocolate of the aristocracy in his attacks on inequality, not as a trivial indulgence, but as a symbol of metabolic privilege, the idea that some people began the day stimulated and nourished, while others began it hungry. Marat was a doctor before he was a revolutionary. He understood the pharmacology of what he was describing. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804, the only successful slave revolt in history to produce an independent state, took place on an island whose entire economic structure was built around colonial plantation crops, including cacao. Saint-Domingue, the French colony that became Haiti, produced roughly 60% of Europe's coffee and 40% of its sugar in the years before the revolution. Cacao was a smaller part of the equation but present throughout. The revolution did not happen because of cacao. It happened because of slavery. But the crops that made the plantation system profitable enough to defend with military force were the same crops that fed and financed European revolutionary movements on the other side of the Atlantic. The bitter drink in the Parisian chocolate house and the enslaved person harvesting cacao pods in the Caribbean were connected by a supply chain that ran through the same colonial system the Haitian revolutionaries destroyed. Dessalines, the general who declared Haitian independence on January 1st, 1804, signed a declaration that disrupted the most profitable colony in the Western Hemisphere. France's response was to demand reparations, a debt for the lost property of French slaveholders, which Haiti began paying in 1825 and did not finish paying until 1947. The total amount transferred was approximately $21 billion in current terms. This is documented in research published by a team including Marlène Daut and Thomas Piketty in a 2022 series in Le Monde. The crops that generated Haiti's export revenue for most of those 122 years of debt payments included cacao. The modern chocolate industry operates on a structure of abstractions that would have been unrecognizable to any of the people who shaped cacao's history before 1850. The price of cacao is set on two commodity exchanges, the New York Board of Trade and the London International Financial Futures and Options Exchange. Traders buy and sell futures contracts for cacao that will not be harvested for months. The price a farmer in Côte d'Ivoire receives for cacao bears no direct relationship to the price on the exchange because of the layers of middlemen, co-ops, processors, and trading houses that stand between the farm and the floor. In 2010, a single hedge fund, Armajaro, purchased approximately 241,000 tons of cacao through the London Exchange, representing roughly 7% of annual global production. The trader behind the purchase was Anthony Ward, known in the market as Chalkfinger. He was attempting to corner the cacao market, acquiring physical stocks large enough to force prices up when delivery demand spiked. The strategy partially worked and then unwound over the following years as new West African harvests increased supply. A man moving 241,000 tons of cacao through a derivatives exchange in London was performing, in digitized and leveraged form, the same basic operation as an Aztec tribute collector, moving cacao loads from Soconusco to Tenochtitlan. Control the supply, control the price. The technology changed, the logic did not. The Theobroma cacao tree itself is facing pressure from a combination of aging plantations, fungal disease, and climate change. The International Center for Tropical Agriculture published a projection in 2013, updated in subsequent years, suggesting that the growing regions of West Africa suitable for cacao cultivation could contract significantly by 2050 as temperatures rise and rainfall patterns shift. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, which together produce roughly 60% of the world's cacao, are both in the projected impact zone. The major chocolate companies responded to this projection not primarily with conservation efforts, but with research into heat-tolerant cacao varieties, which could be planted at higher elevations as lowland regions become less viable. Mars invested $1 billion in a sustainability program between 2009 and 2020, much of it directed at developing hybrid cacao strains. The genetics of a tree first domesticated by Olmec farmers 3,000 years ago is now being engineered in corporate research facilities. The last place cacao was treated as money, in a documented and continuous tradition rather than as a historical curiosity, was in remote parts of the Yucatan. Anthropologists working in the region in the 1940s recorded cacao being used in small transactions in villages that had limited access to the national currency. By the 1960s, even these uses had largely disappeared. There is a single cacao tree, a Criollo variety considered among the most genetically ancient strains in existence, growing in the botanical garden of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México in Mexico City. It was planted there in 1952 by a botanist named Efraim Hernandez Xolocotzi, who collected cuttings from a grove in Tabasco that local farmers claimed had been in continuous cultivation since before the conquest. Hernandez Xolocotzi was a Nahuatl speaker, the son of a village schoolteacher, and one of the few Mexican scientists of his generation who moved between academic botany and indigenous agricultural knowledge without treating either as subordinate to the other. He spent 40 years documenting crop plants in Mexico and published over 200 papers before his death in 1991. The tree he planted is still alive. It produces pods approximately twice per year. The seeds are not used as money. What historians and archaeologists have not settled is whether the Criollo variety Hernandez Xolocotzi preserved from Tabasco is genuinely a pre-Columbian cultivar, or whether it represents centuries of post-conquest crossbreeding that simply retained some ancient genetic characteristics. The DNA analysis is incomplete and contested. The question matters because if the tree is what its origins suggest, it is a living link to the grove keepers and tribute counters and market women who ran the most sophisticated bean-based monetary system in human history. If it is not, it is still a 3,000-year-old conversation between farmers and a plant that refuses to be reduced to either food or money, but has spent most of its existence being treated as both.